Welcome, everyone. What we're diving into today is absolutely fascinating. We're going to connect two massive biblical events from the Old and New Testaments that, at first glance, seem to have literally zero in common. But as we trace the perfect pattern hidden within them, you're going to discover the true meaning of sovereign grace. Honestly, what we cover today might completely flip your understanding of law and grace upside down. Ready? Let's jump right in.
So let's start with a really interesting question. You've got the moldy bread the Gibeonites used in their ancient deception in the book of Joshua, and then you've got a man sick with dropsy at a Sabbath dinner in the book of Luke. What in the world do these two have in common? Would you believe me if I told you that these two scenes, separated by thousands of years, share the exact same spiritual pattern? Let's first look at the desperate, absolute physical weakness of our two main characters. Remember the Gibeonites in Joshua 9? To survive the overwhelming force of the Israelite army, they dressed in worn-out clothes, brought moldy bread, and just desperately clung to hope. They had zero physical power to save themselves. And the man with dropsy in Luke 14? Exactly the same. It was a state of complete despair where he couldn't heal himself. He was completely empty-handed with nothing to offer.
But here is where it gets really interesting. The critics surrounding them. This is the core pattern we're unpacking today. The Israelites judged and condemned the Gibeonites based on their own moral standards because of the deception. And in Luke, the Pharisees used their strict Sabbath rules to condemn Jesus for healing the sick man. As you can see, these two groups are doing the exact same thing. They were using their own narrow, rigid rules to play gatekeeper, trying to judge who deserves salvation and blocking God's grace.
But as the Apostle Paul makes crystal clear in Romans, human morality, or the law, will never save us. The law is just a mirror meant to show us that we're sinners. But the Israelites and the Pharisees made a massive mistake. Instead of using that mirror to look at themselves, they used it as a judge's gavel to strike down others. They were mere creations trying to limit the sovereignty of the Creator himself.
Now let's move to our first key point, the Lord of Time. Let's see how God completely shatters these petty human limits.
These two events perfectly illustrate God's overwhelming sovereignty. In Joshua 10, what did God do to save Gibeon? He literally stopped the sun and the moon. He absolutely shattered the 3D physical limits of time. And in Luke 14, Jesus casually overrides the strict religious time limits of the Sabbath to heal a sick man. It's a brilliant reminder that God's grace is totally unbound by any rules or time limits we humans try to set up. When Jesus said, "The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath," that wasn't just a nice moral lesson. He was declaring right in front of the Pharisees that he holds the exact same cosmic authority that froze the sun over the valley of Ajalon. It really exposes how foolish the Pharisees were for trying to box God in with their own human framework, doesn't it? Let's transition into our second theme, the 3-day secret. We're going to see how God's sovereign grace fills empty time. There's a highly specific detail in Joshua 9. The text deliberately points out that it took exactly 3 days before the Gibeonites' lie was discovered. In the middle of all this urgent wartime history, why does the Bible go out of its way to emphasize this 3-day gap? Let's follow the timeline to unlock this incredible secret. Day 1 is when Gibeon made their deceptive peace treaty, and day 3 is when the truth came out. According to the law, the Gibeonites absolutely deserved to be judged and wiped out after those 3 days. But that judgment was delayed. Do you see what this empty 3-day gap in the Old Testament mirrors? It perfectly lines up with the 3 days Jesus spent in the tomb before his resurrection. God took that delayed period of judgment and completely filled it with his redemptive grace. Jesus' own words about Jonah spending 3 days in the belly of the fish prove this perfectly. The judgment that Gibeon rightfully deserved wasn't fully paid back then. It was paid centuries later on the hill of Golgotha, through Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God. God bypassed the limits of the law and transformed a time of judgment into a time of redemption. That is the secret of the 3 days. That brings us to our third point, peace versus war. Let's look at the ultimate choice we have to make when faced with this immense grace. We really need to define what true reconciliation means in this context. This isn't just some diplomatic compromise to avoid a fight. Theologically, asking for peace means coming before the Creator completely empty-handed. It's admitting you have absolutely zero power and desperately begging for 100% unmerited grace. That is true reconciliation. In Luke 14, Jesus tells the parable of the 2 warring kings. Can a king with 10,000 troops defeat a king marching against him with 20,000? No way. Jesus is showing us that as humans, we are overwhelmingly outnumbered.
We cannot survive a war against a holy God. Our only option for survival is to send a delegation, while the enemy is still far off, hit the ground, and beg for terms of peace based entirely on grace.
And this is where the contrasting choices of Gibeon and the Pharisees hit us with a massive message. Gibeon knew exactly how weak they were. They surrendered completely and chose to ask for grace. They chose peace. But the Pharisees, they arrogantly grabbed their flimsy weapons of self-righteousness and the law, and they basically declared war against God. Listen, the most fatal sin you can commit before a God who saves by grace is to sit in the high seat of pride, reject that grace, and choose to wage war.
Finally, let's wrap up with our last section, the joyful servant. We'll look at what it actually means to step down from the judge's seat.
Look at the steps Jesus outlines in Luke 14. We have got to abandon that high, arrogant seat of judgment where we look down on others. It's only when we willingly walk over and take the lowest seat at the table that the master comes over and says, "Friend, move up higher." We have to remember that we aren't the judges here. We are just creations who were spared and shown mercy.
Now, looking at Joshua 9:23, being told you'll be woodcutters and drawers of water forever sounds like a really harsh punishment, right? But through a spiritual lens, this is an absolute miracle. These foreigners, who deserve to die, were officially invited into the house of God. They got a VIP pass to serve right next to God's holy presence. This wasn't a curse, it was an incredible grace-filled promotion.
Galatians 5 perfectly connects this Old Testament shadow to our New Testament calling. Yes, we've been freed from the limits of the law, but we aren't supposed to use that freedom to just do whatever our flesh wants. Because we are so overwhelmed by God's grace, we willingly choose to serve one another humbly in love. Just like the Gibeonites who joyfully carried water for the house of God, true salvation leads us directly into joyful servitude for the church and for each other.
So we can summarize the ultimate paradox of today's deep dive like this. The very moment we drop the Pharisees' gavel of judgment and pick up the Gibeonites' bucket of servitude, that is when we experience true spiritual freedom. The absolute core of sovereign grace is found in stepping out from under human rules and embracing total humility. I want to leave you with this final question to chew on. Which seat are you sitting in right now? Are you sitting in that high seat of the judge, using your own standards to measure everyone else? Or are you in the lowly seat, completely surrendered and begging for peace and grace? I really hope today's exploration encourages you to remember the God who shatters our limits and fills our empty time with life. Let's choose the path of the joyful servant, not the judge. Thanks so much for joining me.